This is Tiara Yakini speaking. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had a moment to stretch or do whatever you needed to do. This next session is going to provide an overview on assistance animals, and I am delighted to turn the floor over to my amazing colleagues from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Lewis, Tyra Khan, and Marlene Kane.
Kira, thank you. Thank you very much. And my name is Anthony Lewis, and I serve as the Director of the Community Engagement and Education Divisions for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And I want to welcome you to our first session here, first panel discussion, and regarding assistance animals. And assistance animals become a very important part of our society, a very important part of everyday life. And I have the pleasure of my two colleagues here, and I'll have them introduce themselves. First, Tyra.
This is Tyra speaking. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tyra Khan. I am the Director of the Department of Civil Rights' Disability Rights and Compliance Division. I'm also a certified ADA coordinator, and I am appointed by the governor as the interim ADA coordinator for the state of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Marlene to introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marlene Kane. I'm the Director of Investigations for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And I'd also like to give a brief description of myself. I am Caucasian. I have shoulder-length blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt with flowers on. And I am very excited to be here today to talk about this important subject.
All right. Well, Marlene, thank you very much. And to my two colleagues, we're going to jump right in. First question, I think I'll give this first question, Tyra. What are assistance animals?
This is Tyra speaking. So as you said, Tony, assistance animals are a very important aspect of life for some people with disabilities, and many people utilize them in order to fully participate in everyday aspects of life. So we need to start looking at assistance animals with the same mindset as any other medical device that may be used by a person with a disability, and not equating them with pets. There are two types or broad categories of assistance animals. The first being service animals, and then the second are other animals that perform work, provide assistance, or provide therapeutic emotional support for people with disabilities. Those are the two main categories of service animals that I think we're going to talk about today. And I can talk a little bit about more about the laws that are defined or tasks as we move forward.
Okay, thank you, Tyra. Well, what makes it a service animal?
Sure. So, and I don't want to step on Marlene, but I'll talk about a little bit about the different laws and what makes them what they are. So a service animal is defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, which Robin just gave us that really brief, but wonderfully thorough discussion on. The ADA is our federal law that defines what a service animal is. It defines a service animal as a dog or a miniature horse only. Those are the only two species of animals that are entitled to be called a service animal. And those animals have to be individually trained to perform work or tasks to assist with a person with a disability. Individuals can train their own dogs, or they can go through a service, but they have to have training that allow them to do the work or task. So that's the definition of a service animal.
All right, Tyra, thank you. Now, let's, Marlene, I have a question for you. What are the two laws that pertain to service animals?
Okay, I know, Tyra, you wanted to talk a little bit about this, but I can at least mention them. The two most frequently laws that are implicated in assistance animal cases are the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Fair Housing Act. Under Title II of the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, that applies to both state and local laws, and under Title III of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, that applies to businesses that are open for the public.
And this is Tyra, and I can kind of piggyback on that. So as Marlene said, the service animal definition is under that federal law, the ADA. And then we also have the Fair Housing Act. That's another federal law that ensures the rights of people of many protected classes, but for our purposes, we'll highlight disability status. And the Fair Housing Act recognizes that not only do people have, that people have the right to have assistance animals in their property, and that can include service animals, but it also includes those other types of assistance animals that we typically see in rental property, homeowners association, condo, leased properties, et cetera. And those are animals that are outside of that definition of ADA, but they are still animals that are doing some kind of work, performing tasks. But generally, we see them providing emotional assistance or therapeutical assistance for people with disabilities. So those two laws kind of touch and concern each other in terms of they both protect animals as medical devices. One is, again, just that ADA definition of service animal, miniature horse or a dog. Fair Housing Act is a little broader in that it says it can be different types of animals, and it doesn't necessarily have to be trained to perform worker tasks. They can provide emotional or therapeutic support.
Thank you. Now, okay, what are some questions regarding, what are some common questions that you find regarding certifications or training regarding service?
This is my, oh, go ahead, Tyra.
No. This is
Marlene?
Tyra. Sorry, I wasn't sure who that question was asked for, so I'll defer to Marlene.
Okay, I can definitely start this one out. There's really no national certification process for assistance animals. But as many of us know, there is a number of places in the internet and that's out there that claim to be a form of certification. But at the end of the day, if the individual has a need and their impairment meets the definition of a disability and they show a need for the assistance animal, they can ask for a reasonable accommodation.
And this is Tyra speaking. So in talking about the ADA, there is no requirement under the ADA, and when we're talking about service animals, that they be quote unquote certified or registered or have certain documentation or paperwork or even certain training. You can't require a person with a disability who says they have a service animal to produce any kind of paperwork, such as training papers or licensing. They're not required under the federal law. And organizations, as Marlene said, there are organizations that sell those online. Those documents don't convey any legal rights under the ADA, and the Department of Justice, which is the entity that enforces the ADA, does not recognize them as proof that a dog is a service animal.
This is Tony speaking. So, Tyra, then what are some of the differences in training between service animals or ESA or service animals?
Sure, this is Tyra speaking. So service animal has to be trained. Again, as I said earlier, it doesn't have to be trained by an entity. You don't have to pay, thousands of dollars, because to have a service animal raised to be a service animal and trained can cost up to $30,000 to $50,000. And that's a very cost prohibitive thing for many people. So individuals can train their own animals. But the difference that we see in service animals and then other types of assistance animals, again, is that training. A service animal has to be individually trained by someone to perform very specific work, to do some work, to perform tasks, and do something that assists the person with the disability that either they can't do themselves or that they just need a little bit of assistance in doing, and the animal is doing that. When we're talking about other types of assistance animals, and again, like the big umbrella that we see in property or fair housing is those emotional support animals, they don't require any type of training at all. It is their mere presence that provides the therapeutic support for the individual with a disability. Oftentimes we see folks with ESAs, as we call them, the fact that they have one, it assists them because obviously there's companionship and tactile, petting the animal is really good for people and the love that you get from an animal, but it also helps them regulate their day by, I have to get up and I have to feed my dog or cat or whatever it is. I have to take them out. They have to go to the vet. Maybe I have to walk them. So it does provide a little bit more structure and guidance. But those animals, ESAs, do not require any type of training. Back to the service animals for a minute, they have to have that work or task training, but they also have to have behavioral and socialization training, because as Marlene said, state and local governments have to allow those animals in their facilities. Businesses that are open to the public also have to allow service animals in. And so we want to make sure that those animals are properly trained to tolerate different environments, like going into a grocery store, a movie theater, restaurant. We don't want them to be acting out or, uncomfortable in those situations. So behavioral training as well as worker task training is really important for service animals.
So, well, actually, this question will be for Marlene or actually Tyra. You know, we have a lot of different regulations, we have the different laws, but what would be considered, because I know oftentimes we find, I would say unique animals. Uh, what would what would qualify as a unique animal? And is there any regulation regarding what can be considered a service animal or unique animal or an emotional support? I mean, what are some of the either are there rules or regulation laws, or what's some of the things that you find, either common misconceptions or some of the questions that you found around unique animals?
Well, this is Marlene
Just
speaking. In terms of service animals, those are mainly, dogs and in rare instances, miniature ponies. But in terms of emotional support or comfort animals, we have seen within our own department a wide variety of cases. Typically, you will see emotional support or comfort animals. They're usually dogs, cats. Um, some of the unique cases that we have seen, we've had cases with pot-bellied pigs that were an emotional support animal, chickens, bearded dragons, which are lizards, snakes, bunnies, and hamsters and gerbils. So those are some of the unique animals that we have seen that have been filed with this department in the past. And so when we get those type of cases, we look at them on a case-by-case basis. And as long as that person has a disability and there's a need for that animal, then the respondent, management company, landlord, dormitory, the housing provider must start that interactive communication process. They must be speaking with the individual to find out what is the need and how can they assist them in meeting that need if possible, or maybe a possible alternative. It's important to note that when you're looking at somebody and they may have a certain type of animal, I think right away in terms of the cases that we see, housing in specific, the housing provider may not have they may have a no pet rule. They don't want to have the pets in there. And so they automatically want to tell them no without even asking them or knowing that these animals are either a service animal and or an emotional support animal. And they must begin that process. They must have that interactive communication to find out what the needs are. How can they meet the needs? They cannot just tell them plain out no, because they must make that exception.
This is Tyra speaking. If I could just kind of add a little bit to that, and we're only talking about the Fair Housing Act here because, as Marlene said, service animals are only those two, miniature horse and a dog. So they never change. That does not change. But when we're talking about the fair housing realm, as Marlene said, it can be different animals depending upon the circumstances. And HUD has issued some really good guidance on that in 2020. It's in 19 pages and it may seem lengthy, but it's really good, plain language. And it looks at it from two different perspectives. A person with a disability who wants to request an assistance animal as a reasonable accommodation. And then for the landlord or property owner, housing provider, what do I do when I get these kind of requests? And so they talk about commonly kept household animals versus unique animals, like Marlene just mentioned, those potbelly pigs and bearded dragons. And the guidance tells us that if it's an animal that's commonly domesticated animal, like a dog, cat, small bird, rabbit, hamster, turtle, fish, Those are generally should be granted. Again, as Marlene said, if the requester or the tenant can show that there's a disability related need for the animal, and that person shouldn't have to go through too many hoops to get that animal. It's a little bit different if it is a unique animal, like Marlene said, and we've seen goats and chickens and things like that with cases that we've had in our department. And the guidance tells us if the tenant or the person who's requesting a unique animal, if it's not a commonly kept household animal, there's a little bit of a substantial burden or a higher burden for the requester, the tenant, to show that they need that specific type of animal as a disability related therapeutic need. And so that doesn't mean that the housing provider or landlord has a right to deep dive into your medical documentation. It just means that they may have to submit some documentation from their healthcare provider to confirm the need for that specific animal. And so there is that little bit of distinction between what can be asked for and required of with an animal under the Fair Housing Act.
All right, I have another quick question, and either actually Marlene or Tyra can. We are embarking on a holiday weekend, and so there's going to be a lot of travel, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of travel. So what are some of the rules or established guidelines regarding airplane travel for either emotional support or service animal?
This is Marlene speaking. For airplane travel, airlines may not refuse to allow a service animal based on its breed or physical type, but they may require that the dog fit on the handler's lap or within the handler's foot space on the plane. And they may also require that service dogs be harnessed or leashed on the plane and in the airport.
This is Tyra, and just a word on that, because Robin mentioned it earlier. Again, Air Carrier Access Act is a federal law. Our department does not have jurisdiction over that. It's very, very particular and specific. They changed their guidance 3 years ago and said now they only allow service animals, and they only allow a defined service animal as a dog. It used to be a little bit more broad. I'm sure all of us have heard and seen stories on the news of people bringing peacocks or other types of animals on the airplane and saying that they're service animals. The air carrier access is probably the most limited in the ones that we're talking about. It only applies to airlines. It defines a service animal as a dog only. So you wouldn't be bringing or allowed to be bringing any other animal on the plane and calling it a service animal. There's other, they can. We know that you can bring other animals on and pay the fee and things like that as pets. But if you're identifying your animal as a service animal, it must be a dog only in order to meet the Air Carrier Access Act standards. And there is documentation under that federal guidance that says the airline can ask you for a little bit more certification. Well, I shouldn't say certification, documentation from your healthcare provider, establishing the need for the animal and that the animal is in good physical health and things like that. There's 2 different forms on the Department of Transportation's website. That's the entity that enforces the Air Carrier Access Act. And so that does apply there.
This is Tony speaking. So for someone that has a service, and let's say they encountered a situation where an employee of an establishment asked them for documentation. What would that person? What should they do, or in the event they were mistreated, or someone implied, well, that's not really a service dog. What recourse do they have?
Oh, this is Tyra. I can kind of start with that. So just to back up a little bit. So if, as Marlene mentioned, the ADA Title III applies to private businesses that are open to the public. So if a person with a disability has a service animal and they want to go into any business that's open to the public, as I mentioned earlier, restaurants, doctors' offices, movie theaters, grocery stores, laundromats, all the things that we visit on our, in our life, there's only 2 questions that the business can ask the individual with a disability if they have an animal with them. And they can only ask those questions, the 2 questions, if it's not obvious or apparent that the person is a person with a disability and that they're utilizing the animal for a disability related need. So if it's not obvious or apparent, they can ask 2 questions. Is this a service animal that's required because of your disability? And that's a yes or no question. If their answer was no, then they really wouldn't need to go further because they only have to allow service animals. If the answer was yes, they can ask a follow-up question to ask the individual, what work or task is the animal trained to perform? Now, the handler of the dog has to identify the work or task. They can't, the entity, the business can't ask the individual to demonstrate, please show me what your dog can do. Or as we said earlier, provide or ask for any documentation or things like that. They can just ask the two questions. So, and we, like Marlene will tell you, we see this all the time, that businesses, there's a lot of them that don't know the law, or the information doesn't get filtered down from the top. So the top people may have some training. It doesn't go all the way down to, the folks that are at the door. So if someone were to encounter an issue where they walked into a store and they were asked to provide those, licensing documentation, things like that, it's unfortunately, it's not the individual with a job, disability's job to educate the public. The public should be educating themselves on this, but that does happen. So the recourse that they would have would be to come to our department. If they wanted, if they were denied access, they could file a complaint with our department or the Department of Justice. And I'll let Marlene talk a little bit about how they could file the complaint.
Yes, this is Marlene speaking. Before I do that, I just want to mention, in case we haven't said this earlier, but service animals can go anywhere pretty much where the individual goes. That's including like movie theaters, banks, and stores. And the definition, as Tyra has described, is very broad. But there may be some exceptions, for instance, and I'm just going to mention this because I thought it was important. Let's just say that someone's having surgery and they're in the surgical room. That may be one instance where the service animal may not be allowed entry. But when somebody comes to us and they state to us that I've been not denied access, denied rental, because I have an emotional support animal, or because my animal is a service animal, then as long as it's timely, they name a basis and it's jurisdictional to our department, we take a complaint and we investigate each and every one of those cases. I did bring with me some examples, and I don't know if this is a good time to bring them up or not, of cases that we have investigated and resolved involving assistance animals. Is this a good time to share that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we had a case with a claimant whose son was diagnosed with autism. And this particular son was a minor. He had 2 emotional support chickens. The problem was they lived in the city limits, and the city served the parents with a city code violation, and they were asked to remove the chickens by a certain date. The 2 chickens had a calming effect on the claimant's son, and they were instrumental in treating the effects of his disability. Oftentimes when we get a complaint, we do go out and do what we call on-site visits. So the investigator went out, sat with the family and the child with the 2 chickens to see his interaction. And it was remarkable from what she shared with us, how these 2 emotional support chickens, just holding and petting the chickens and that tactile feeling had a calming effect for the claimant's son. So the investigator was able to resolve the case with the city providing a reasonable accommodation so that the claimant's son could keep those 2 chickens, and the city was required to develop a reasonable accommodation policy and to train the staff on how to handle such requests in the future. We had another interesting case where the claimant lived in a sorority house. She had an emotional support bunny. The claimant and respondent were involved in the interactive communication process, and the bunny was kept in a separate room, not in the sleeping room of the sorority members. The claimant even went as far as to buy an ear filter in case there were any type of allergy issues with others. However, no one had an issue with it. The respondent cited several reasons why they could not accommodate the emotional support bunny, to include, well, someone down the road may be allergic to that bunny, or it may disrupt other people. But the main reason was it was against the rules. And we worked on this case. It's very interesting. The claimant ended up dropping out of school her senior year, delayed her from graduating. This particular case resolved for $60,000 in the development of a reasonable accommodation policy and fair housing training for all the staff so that they could educate themselves on how to, respond to these type of requests in the future. And if I have time for one more, I had a claimant file a complaint with the department as she had an emotional support hamster that was not allowed to stay with her in the dormitory room, which she shared with one other student, who, by the way, signed a statement stating that she didn't have an issue with the hamster staying in the dorm. The respondent failed to communicate in the interactive communication process, meaning they flat out said no, they didn't want to hear or see anything. And they denied the claimant the ability to have her emotional support animal to stay in the dorm with her. She had to remove the hamster. In this case, ended up settling for $35,000, and they were also made to develop a reasonable accommodation policy and to have training, ongoing training annually for all the staff that were involved with the students in these type of requests. Those are three of the cases that I wanted to share today. Thank you.
This is Tony speaking. Thank you. Thank you, Marlene. As we come to the close of of our session here this morning, is there an idea in terms of time frame from the time when somebody would submit an application or receive a response for a service animal or emotional support animals? Is there, when folks, is there a time frame for something like that?
Well, this is Marlene speaking. It's recommended that when someone does ask for a reasonable accommodation and there's no response, that within a week, they follow up with whoever they asked. Because for our department, when we have cases, and we've seen cases come to our department where someone asked, they're waiting 2 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months, and they're not getting a response, that's actually in effect a denial. And so we treat those cases as a denial of the reasonable accommodation request. So it's important to make sure they follow up and, document that they've asked again. And they obviously can come to our department if they want to file a complaint, and we will definitely assess their concerns.
This is Tyra speaking. If I could just add to that, and this is part of the educational component that our department does, is when we do trainings, we tell housing providers that you should have a policy, right? Everyone who's engaged in the real estate transactions, whether you're an owner, whether you're a leasing agent, whether you're a property manager, there should be clear clear policies on reasonable accommodations and modifications for tenants. And it should be communicated to people at the onset, because housing providers have to make accommodations throughout the life of the tenancy. So maybe during the accommodation, the initial process where someone comes to look at property, if they have an assistance animal, they should be allowed to bring it there. So have those policies in place, train staff on policies, review the policies periodically to make sure that people understand them, because there's turnover in offices. And then just stay up to date on any changes or nuances in the law.
Well, this is Tony speaking. Thank you very much. Are there any so to kind of wrap this up, where can folks find resources on these topics? I know we've had a wealth, you've been a wealth of information, and so where can folks find either webinars? I know Tyra, you just spoke of some training that here at MDCR and Marlene here at MDCR that we offer. So where can folks find these resources on this topic?
This is Marlene speaking. As you indicated, our department is a great resource. And in the chat, you will see the links to the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. We have a housing team that conducts fair housing trainings throughout the year, oftentimes with our fair housing partners. HUD, I have the link to HUD in there. They also have a website with a plethora of information available. And then we have 5 fair housing centers in the state of Michigan. In West Michigan, Detroit, the Ypsilanti area, Kalamazoo, and then in Flint. And we will also have in the chat the links to their organizations. They offer resources. They offer trainings throughout the year. The information that they have, just like MDCR and HUD, is very important, and it'll give you most likely what you're looking for. And if you don't have what you're looking for, you'll have numbers, phone numbers to contact, or emails to contact. Also, the DOJ has a hotline that's going to be in the chat. And there's also an organization called the National Fair Housing Alliance. And I'll make sure we get that in the chat as well. But those are all great resources that you can, take a look at. You can take courses, trainings, get fact sheets on different areas that have to do with assistance animals. It's a great opportunity if you have a chance to take a look at those websites.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you all so much. I'm sure that our audience found that information to be very useful. We did have several questions in the chat that we will be sure to respond to after the program. Again, we are going to have another short break and we will resume at 10:25 a.m. Please feel free to stay logged in. We will see you back for a presentation on digital accessibility at 10:25. Thank you.